host. This is Lauren Archer. And this is Eric Boyd. He's the president of Hacklab, who is our kind host this evening. And hi, I'm Hillary Predko. Thank you all for coming. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different things I saw while traveling across China. I was looking for kind of like sites of production and mass production, makerspaces, this kind of thing. And I'll get a little bit more into why I did that. But what you will expect to see this evening is very many pictures. I'm just going to kind of tell you some stories about different things I saw, some kind of insights I've gleaned from talking to different people, reading different things, and that kind of thing. You can find me on Twitter at Hillary Predko. And there's my name some more. So I do a lot of things as Little Data with Lindy Wilkins. So we do kind of community engaged tech stuff. We run a monthly meetup for people involved in makerspaces called Make Friends Monthly. And currently I'm working on my imaginary master's degree. So this is part of it. I pulled up this quote by Joan Didion because this is her talking about why she wrote Slouching Towards Bethlehem. She says, I went to San Francisco to write Slouching Towards Bethlehem because I had not been able to work in some months. I had been paralyzed by the conviction that writing was an irrelevant act. The world I had understood, it no longer existed. And if I was to work again at all, it would be necessary for me to come to terms with disorder. So I've been having a lot of feelings about what it is to be a maker. There's a lot of garbage in the world. Not sure if you've noticed, or if you go to a store, there's just tons and tons of things, and you probably have already owned a lot of those things in the past, but then you buy them again. And like, I'm totally part of this as well. So that is what made me think that I was going to backpack through China and look at a bunch of sites of production. So I'll tell you about some of this stuff. So I'm going to show a few pictures from Guangzhou first, because I took more streetscape photos there, and it kind of, I think, sets the scene for what the Pearl River Delta is kind of like. So this is, you know, walking along the Pearl River. There's a lot of young people out. It's like very demographically young. Tons of migrant folks are working in most cities in the Pearl River Delta. And there's like just every materials market everywhere. Guangzhou has like shelf market, very specific like rivet market. So you just walk around and there's all these different things. And so the Pearl River Delta has become the largest urban area, both by size and population. So this is Guangzhou, Dongguan, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and like several other cities in this kind of extended urban area. And just markets everywhere. And tons of skyscrapers. And there's all these skyscrapers that are fully covered in LEDs. And this animation was my favorite because there was always this flaming soccer ball on the side of this building in Guangzhou. But from there, oh, and also cool LED art. But from there, I headed to Shenzhen, and so a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about this evening is centered around Shenzhen. I spent a lot of time there, and there's a high-speed bullet train that goes like every several minutes from Guangzhou to Shenzhen, and you get corralled into this really high-tech chute. And there was really incredibly fast trains. They were like 400 kilometers an hour. They were really, really fast. So Shenzhen is very trendy in some circles. If you spend time in makerspaces and the hardware scene and that kind of thing, Shenzhen has likely come up. It's where most consumer electronics are made. So like huge companies like Foxconn make all the Apple products there. But also there's this kind of beginning, bleeding edge of hardware entrepreneurs and makers showing up and doing their own thing. Also share the slides later. Like all of these things like this are hyperlinks because, I don't know, it's the internet, of course. So one of the first places where you'll kind of get oriented in the maker scene in Shenzhen is Hashangbei. This is like 20 city blocks worth of components markets, electronics, that kind of thing. And you'll be like walking down the street and there's drones flying in the air. Everyone's trying to sell you a drone. Everyone's trying to sell you everything. And like Shenzhen is a city that's had unprecedented growth. It's about, by some accounts, up to 18 million people. And it was about 300,000 people in the 80s. And this was the first special economic zone in China. So this is where people were able to begin to do more free market activity. So it's just blown up. Like most electronics, every electronic I can touch in my vicinity probably came through a port in Shenzhen. And these markets are fun and vast and wacky. And there's just LEDs everywhere. This is like one of the most communist things I saw. It's like telling you how LEDs will create cooperation. And there's a lot of cell phones and cell phone components. I'll talk a bit more about the ecosystem around smartphones in a little bit, but, oh, and here's some drones. And like, I feel like this photo kind of gives a sense of what it's like to walk through the markets. Like people have kind of their whole life there. Their kids are frequently with them, they're eating food, they're hanging out, and like all of these stalls kind of function as like an anchor for a factory. So you would kind of go there and you start a relationship with someone, and then you would be ordering parts in like tens of thousands or millions. So yeah, lots and lots of cell phone components. Basically anything inside a smartphone, you can buy like 1 million units of each little part. And then there's this kind of phenomenon with these phones that have really exciting cases and they're really colorful. So this is something called Shenzhen, and I'm going to talk more in depth about it after. But one thing that I found really interesting is you have all these like secondary and tertiary markets that come out of the main market. So, okay, everyone is buying, you know, millions of parts. So then you have these guys who drive around and they're like bringing them to different parts of the market. You can get all your shipping materials, there's shipping alleys, and then there's guys who will fix your dolly if your dolly breaks. And it starts to really kind of like build out. Like it's really truly an ecosystem. Like this isn't just like a few constituent parts. Like Shenzhen is so deeply embedded in stuff getting built. It's fascinating. And then where I was staying, there was also people who were pulling apart old cell phones. And I mean, this is something that happens en masse in different parts of the world, but like the kind of not super safe recycling of e-waste was like something I don't understand exactly where it all feeds into each other, but there would be people sitting on the street and just pulling apart circuit boards. And this is like the plastic parts that you see there. They don't want to keep the plastic, they want to solve the valuable chips. And you can buy all sorts of like different machines. So this is something that's separating screens for mobile phones, the tiny CNC. But all of these markets are actually shifting a lot. So Taobao and like AliExpress are these online suppliers. Like AliExpress is probably something, if you're a maker, you've decided that it's going to be better to get your thousands of LEDs from China through AliExpress. And things like Taobao are doing that as well. So now instead of having like a stand in a market, a lot of suppliers are just going straight online. And I met some people who had, like the first tour I got of a market was from this really lovely man named Joe who runs a robotics startup. And he came to Shenzhen and he wasn't even doing any of his sourcing in person. He was sitting in a hotel room having Taobao packages arrive every day. And I thought that was really interesting. Like that's not how. I don't know exactly why that happened. I don't know. This was one of my favorite things I saw in Hacklab.to. This is like an underpass where you walk under a main street. And this is like a screen that's displaying an ad. But it's an ad about like this machine that will laminate mobile screen, like, yeah, mobile phone screens. And then everyone's kind of standing there and they're just, you know, determining whether or not they like this mobile screen laminator. And it's just this intensely targeted ad that is like the epitome of Hacklab.to. I thought it was just totally fascinating. I would keep on finding the screen and just standing there. And it's super cool. And I also had the opportunity to go and find some factories. I qualify this with like, I met people who were involved in like the hardware scene and running hardware startups. So I was very lucky to be able to like tag along with them in different ways. And these guys who run dangerous prototypes, like every time they would go to a factory to do something for work, they would just invite whoever was hanging out in Shenzhen with them. So that was super gracious. But yeah, you would tend to like show up in an area of the city. It's a sprawling metropolis. You kind of end up somewhere strange. You don't know really what's going on, and you're texting someone on WeChat, and you're sending pictures and asking if you're in the right place. And eventually, you get to a factory. So this is a PCBA assembly house run by this guy, Mike, that he gave me a tour of. And so this is where he holds all of his like solder mask silk screens. This is what it looks like when he's putting on the solder mask. This is something going into an oven. I don't know how much you all know about hardware, but like basically any electronics you have, these processes have been run on them, and this is how they're fabricated. This is a pick and place machine. And so this guy's doing a lot of stuff with smaller level maker people. I think he probably has like 50 employees. And then like, so this is looking at different components. people are assembling things, there's hand assembly. This guy who was hand soldering, he would just go down like a series of pins, like all of them would just be populated with solder immediately. He was incredibly good at it. And these actually on the right are the driver boards for those like hoverboards that were kind of the big Christmas thing, which I'm also going to talk about a bit more. And then Mike took me to this sewing factory, and I just looked at it briefly. And then, so this is somewhere I visited with dangerous prototypes. It was a flex PCB factory, and I had to wear these boots on my shoes. So actually, if you ever need flex PCBs, Ian and Jen run a website called Dirty PCBs. So this is their kind of supply chain for that. And this was a lot more extensive because they're actually like doing the assembly and like a little intimidating. It's really, really loud and everyone's doing really repetitive tasks. And this job seemed kind of like a Sisyphus-like task. Every board that's come up bad in these sheets, this woman cuts out and then she tapes in one that is a good board so it can go into the pick and place. And these are all like tiny squares of tape that she's placing with an X-Acto knife. And there's just like so many processes. Like this is the same factory, and here they have these giant mills, and they're just like making tiny holes in circuit boards, and they have just rooms and rooms and rooms full of this stuff. And there's thousands of these factories all throughout the city. These guys are cutting some boards apart, and then more of this kind of like you just walk across these vast spaces following people. One kind of quote that people were saying, like the kind of hardware folks I was hanging out with, is if you haven't made a U-turn, it's not a factory visit. You're just like totally lost out in the suburbs somewhere. Before I talk about this, just like one thing I found visiting factories is like it was both kind of like scarier than I thought and less scary. Like I don't think it's necessarily something that's good or bad or black and white. Like people have quite competitive wages working in the Pearl River Delta. Like the minimum wage is about $6 USD, and most people are getting paid above and beyond that. But like people are working 10 to 12-hour days, and it's not like super glamorous work. You're doing a lot of repetitive tasks, sitting in uncomfortable positions. So I don't know how I feel about it all. But this is a fiber optic place that I visited. They have this cool showroom. It was pretty. And then this I thought was really cool. So I don't know if like EL panels are like these things that light up in different ways, and they were producing them here, and they're all silk screened. So like different parts will light up different colors by being silk screened. And then I visited a 3D printing factory, and it was kind of the same as a lot of 3D printing places I've seen in North America, which I thought was really interesting. Like I guess with more robotics and less labor, it starts to just be kind of similar. And I visited Seed Studio. So if you're in the maker scene, you've probably heard of them. They're kind of this interesting bridge between some approaches from like North American making and Chinese making. They do like open hardware development and some stuff like that. So about 90% of their business is international, and they like support people from crowdfunding stages to manufacturing. And it was cool to see their space because they're quite different. They have about 260 employees, and 50 of them work in research and development. So like really, really heavy R&D and like working in small teams and doing products that are down to like 100 units. So it's like way far away from like the million MOQ that a lot of the stuff is doing. And they call themselves open hardware facilitators, which I think is interesting because there's a lot of like rhetoric around accelerators and like making tons of units, like creating, you know, your billion-dollar startup. And with this, they're like really functioning on a smaller scale. I was lucky enough to like have a talk, like Eric Pan, the guy who runs Seed, gave a talk, and he was talking about how he feels like his company's grown too fast, and he wants to like enable a ecosystem around kind of open hardware development rather than like own the scene. So I thought that was really cool. And in their factory, people have a lot more autonomy. Like he hires people who are engineers, and they kind of like control a cell of the factory where they make all the decisions related to pick and place or soldering or something like that. And it was a really pretty factory, so I have lots of pictures of it for you. These are some dangerous prototypes boards. I was like, oh neat, those are my pals. And then this is a solder station, which is very nicely ventilated. And here's a labeling machine that's just beautiful. And there's a couple slides I have, but this is Eric Pan in the corner, very dark, and he's talking about kind of the hardware ecosystem that he would like to create and facilitate. And like, so he's really helped bring maker culture to China in a couple different ways. So him and this guy, David Lee, who runs Hacked Matter, they started lobbying the government to create more infrastructure for makerspaces, and that's happened. So the Prime Minister, Lee King, again, I can't say that properly, pardon me. So he announced that there was an initiative called Mass Makerspace, and like put forth a bunch of policies related to that. And so with this was the start of 2015, and so many spaces have opened up in the past year. And I visited a couple. This is Seg Makerspace. This is in Hotshot Bay in one of the giant buildings. But it's interesting because like the kind of life and noise and all that stuff you get in the markets didn't really seem to translate. I visited several spaces that were pretty quiet, and there wasn't really a lot of people working. But they had like really cool infrastructure and a lot of interesting like tools and that kind of thing. This is Ian and Jin's office, which they called the party office. So they had their company where they have a warehouse as well as an office. And then this is an apartment that they've kind of created something of a makerspace in. So this is where they like just have soldering irons. People are hanging out and kind of like creating different projects. And the kind of like hackerspace ethos where people are just inventing weird stuff rather than like a startup incubator ethos. There seemed like quite a divide in the things that I was seeing. So like a lot of people are just doing kind of hackerspace projects like in hotel rooms, in apartments, and like all the spaces seem to be much more geared towards startups. So I thought that was super interesting. This is Ling Ling. He's the dog of the Dangerous Prototypes, who's always hanging out at like the office and that kind of thing. And this is a very blurry picture, but I think this kind of exemplifies some of the projects that I thought were most interesting coming out of some of the hackerspace stuff. Like this is an anodized capacitor that Ian and Jin decided that they could just try anodizing caps of capacitors. That's, if you don't know much about electronics, that's like making that pink. So this would be something that's like a very low level electronic component that would just be plain metal. And they decided, why not just make them every color of the rainbow? But if you're going to be doing that, they were prototyping this idea like at industrial scale. So they're going to the capacitor factory and they're going to the anodizing factory. And they're putting all this stuff together, and like they have 10,000 capacitors. They're like, oh wow, it worked. So that is kind of, yeah, it's just something I thought was really cool about Shenzhen. Like there was also this guy I met who put like breath mints into pick and place reels. So this is like what would usually have like resistors or other small low level components. And he just found he could reel whatever he wanted. So he used breath mints. I don't know if you can buy those.
How many is on a reel? Like 1,000?
Something like that, yeah. This is Charles Pax of Pax Instruments. Maybe I will check his website and see if that's gone up. So these are some projects from Hong Kong Maker Fair. Sorry, I'm probably talking way too long or anything, so I gotta like speed up a little bit. But so yeah, the kind of startup thing in Shenzhen is pretty immense. Like a lot of people, either Chinese or foreigners, are going to Shenzhen and they're trying to create a business that, you know, has billions of dollars in sales and like has huge supply chains. So that's a lot of the push there. This was a company that was doing like fitness bands. And I visited a couple of startup accelerators, but I wasn't allowed to take pictures. But Accelerator and Highway 1 are kind of the biggest ones that take in foreigners, and they actually seemed really cool. Like both their spaces were really lovely. Hacks has like this giant, beautiful space, and they just give you like $150,000, and you're supposed to make a project. And it seems like some people make cool projects, so I was pretty into that. But I want to talk a bit about Shanghai. So this comes back to like those phones that have the cases, they're all colorful, and comes back to the hoverboards. This is kind of analogous to open hardware, but not the same. So open hardware would be how people make something like an Arduino in North America, where you're sharing your designs, and you know, a lot of people are thinking towards like democratization of technology and education. But Shanghai is really about getting things to market quickly, sharing ideas so everyone can get paid and make money and get products to market. So it's like networks of companies working together. So there's something called like Gongba or like open boards. So it's similar to something like Arduino where you're sharing your board designs, but it's just because nobody cares about the ownership because everyone's able to get things to market really quickly. So hang on, just have like a couple facts and figures written down about Shenzhen. So about 300 million units are sold a year. And to be fair, these are the really colorful phones that you look at and like this kind of becomes like an icon for it. But realistically, most of these like look like an Android phone. They look like a Apple phone. People are just like creating smartphones that have different variations. But there are like some really neat innovations. Like some phones will have 7 speakers and they're mostly targeted to like construction workers. So that's really cool. And it's like this emergent network that's really informal. One thing, so Sylvia Littner is a woman who writes quite a bit about this kind of stuff. And she talks about the city as like an embedded learning platform. So we'll have mentors and they have markets and they're creating these things and they're selling them. And I just want to qualify that this is like a very Chinese methodology that like, so these aren't necessarily people who are talking to makerspaces. So everything I'm telling you about this is mostly things I've read about. So if I'm wrong, I don't know, don't hold me to it. I am giving the knowledge that I have got so far. One quote I really liked though was David Lee was talking about Shenzhen hackers think makers are really cute. It's like having someone come home from kindergarten with their art. So like these guys are hardcore. They get phones to market in like 30 days. It's a very, very different kind of world. And the hoverboard actually has a totally Shenzhen like supply chain and ecosystem. So there's a Planet Money podcast about the supply chain of like the hoverboard that if you want to kind of like have a better idea of how these things emerge, they did some cool journalism around that. It's pretty short. And then leaving Shenzhen, if you go to Hong Kong, you exit by this elevator. And if you go to the airport, there's this incredibly beautiful airport that makes you feel like you're an architectural rendering. But from Shenzhen, there's another city that I spent some time in trying to figure out some of this stuff, and this was Yiwu. So this is very different from Shenzhen. It's a landlocked trade hub, and mostly this is for like trade in small commodities. So there are like these 5 massive buildings that make the main international trade mart thing. So they're about 5 stories each, and they snake all the way across the city, and it's absolutely massive. It's like the largest structure I've ever been in. So yeah, there's 4 million square meters of shop space. 62,000 different stalls with 1.7 million different products. It is massive and astronomical and mind-blowing. The name of this came from the actual tagline for Yiwu is a sea of commodities, a paradise for shoppers. And yeah, so I made friends with someone in Shenzhen who also wanted to go check this out. So we flew to Yiwu and we're just walking around day to day, like looking at this stuff and having our minds absolutely blown. Like every last thing that you've interacted with in your life can be found here in like every variety. And it's strange too, because like each stall, like none of these screws will be the same. Like you'll go into something that looks like a hardware store and there's every single tiny variation on possibility forever, for everything you could imagine. So yeah, this is an estimation from one article. If you were to spend 3 minutes in each booth and walk 8 hours a day, it would take you a whole year to go through the whole market. And there were a couple days I walked like 8 hours a day and you just get so tired and like overwhelmed, and there's not a lot of places to stop and get a snack. These are like all these calipers. Every bike and box probably come through Yiwu. And this is one of my favorite pictures, the glitter outlet. Working in the glitter factory would be really tough. And like similar to the kind of stalls in Hashang Bay, each of these is going to represent a whole factory. So people would be coming here from all over the world and they're establishing a relationship with somebody who has a factory, and then they're doing massive orders. So a lot of people are doing this for like fast fashion brands, for dollar stores, like globally. And within the city, like there's tons of different kinds of food from all over the world because predominantly it's a trade city. So that was pretty cool. And this is the smallest drone I've ever seen. The toys I took a lot of pictures of because they're way more interesting than umbrellas. This was something interesting though. So like I do a lot of sewing and fashion stuff myself, and like to find like these are these really cool lace backs. If I would find this at a store in Canada, I'd be so excited. But like when there's so much volume, I was like looking at the stuff and I just like couldn't even process it, and like didn't know how to approach like thinking maybe I'd buy something because I'd need 10,000. But people are in like these very small stalls that kind of contain all the things that they sell. Something about the woman with the toy guns I thought was pretty intense. Yeah, I just walked around and around this place for a really long time. And there's like this child's playground, which was pretty cool. Yeah, so like most things in the world, if you go to Dollarama, they probably come from like this region in China. And so I was staying in a hotel in Yiwu because there was no youth hostels, and it's a very businessman city, so we get these call girl cards slid under my door.
Did they have condoms on the side table too?
They did, and socks. If you need to change your socks after the deed, that's your option. It was kind of a war where like people would rip up the cards and leave them in the hall and protest. That was interesting. And then so this is another market I went to in Yiwu. I spent less time here, but it was a little bit more bizarre. This is going to be a bit of gratuitous showing you guys cool machines for a few minutes, because this is the production and materials market where they sell machines. So one interesting thing is like, if you want to set up a factory, you don't need to have really like, you don't need to have contractors like building your machines custom at this point. Like that stuff is mass produced as well. So you would go somewhere like this. And it was a very large building. People were driving their cars. And this is now like mid-December in northern China, so it was very cold. I was just walking around with my friend like through this vast land, being very chilly. It was not very populous. We saw 4 other people shopping in the whole day we spent there. And this is their lounge. And this is a chandelier. I really like it. But yeah, so there's like these stores that would be full of like the most fascinating, intricate machinery that you could just order en masse to like set up your food packaging plant or whatever else. This is a bedazzling machine, a very large bedazzling machine. And like these, you can put, like this is packaging food. This is putting rivets on jeans. This is injection molding, which is pretty cool. I thought injection molding would be like way larger, but they're not the most large. This is printing on ribbons. This is like a silk screen thing that goes down this giant table. And this is a terrible picture, but I thought this one's particularly interesting. It's like how lotion gets in tubes and sealed. This is how coffee cups get made. This is a nice, long process. And yeah, so it's just like this massive, massive building that is just full of every imaginable thing. There's the maker favorite, the laser cutter, which there was only one laser cutter store in this whole giant market. Like, I just feel like laser cutters don't factor into how people produce things. And then like things are so big, you just leave them outside. Here's a loom that was just outside because what, I'm gonna run off with your loom. And this was actually the roof. But then there were still cars there. Like they somehow had a way of getting all the cars upstairs, which like walking out into this, I felt like I was in a different world. It was very confusing.
Is there like a car elevator or they just like drive up to the ramp?
I couldn't figure out where that was. I walked around. There's gotta be like a ramp or like, I don't know what it was. And these were just the most beautiful machines in the world. They make different knitted cable housings. I really, really just, I was so into this stall. And there's also a badminton court. So yeah, that's the production materials market. And then the next day we're in Yiwu, we were walking around downtown and we started finding these kind of alleys where people were selling all sorts of like materials for like shipping and bags and that kind of thing, and die cutting different materials. And so there's like, these were all kind of like concrete stalls and alleys where different things were getting made. So what I thought was really interesting about this is like, I tended to think about like manufacturing as kind of like black box with like a really hermetically sealed factory where something goes in and it comes out the other side. But like, I find like things are so piecemeal, and like people are doing things as like small businesses and families and really tiny organizations. And like, yeah, I thought this was really, really cool. Like just, I don't imagine, you know, a stack of jigs with dies on them and then you get something in your hand that looks perfect. But like the kind of back end of all of this is just as messy and bizarre as everything else. But like, we just don't see it. And then, so this stuff's a bit less manufacturing oriented, but jumping back to Shenzhen, another place I visited was Dafan Oil Painting Village. So this is where tons and tons of replica oil paintings get made. There's thousands of artists who are living here. And it's really fascinating to walk through because there's both galleries and people are like painting in alleys and on the streets. And you can commission really inexpensive oil paintings. I think you can also do it online should you ever need that. But I think this is interesting because it starts to raise the question of what is creativity and authorship in the era of the network. Because to be able to like produce cell phones again and again, like that's something that we think of as like reproducible, but then like also to have art in the question, I think is like this interesting tension. And like there's both original art produced there as well, and things that are reproduced, like it's immensely skillful, and these are people who've trained for really, really long amounts of time to be able to do it. This is also a hyperlink. Should you want to check it out later, it's a quite interesting article about, yeah, I just pulled that actually as a question from the article. The Dafan Oil Painting Village is really, really beautiful. And then I want to talk for a minute about duplitecture. So this is kind of the same idea, but applied to architecture. There's like entire neighborhoods where different architectural styles have been reproduced. And this is Window of the World in Shenzhen. And what I love so much about this is like the Parthenon, the Eiffel Tower, and then El Pulpo Mechanico from Burning Man. So this is an art car from Burning Man that's front and center at Window of the World, which is like this attraction where people come. It can be hard to get a visa if you're Chinese national, so it's a way to kind of experience some architecture from different parts of the world. But like, the inclusion of the art car is like the collapsing of high and low culture and history and time. And I couldn't get over it. I mean, I'm telling you about it now, so I guess I'm not over it. Yeah, I just found that incredibly fascinating.
Is the Eiffel Tower like scaled, or is it full size?
I think it's scaled. It is further back from these, but I didn't actually pay to go into Window of the World because it was like the equivalent of $40. I don't know. I mean, I made it across the world, and then I didn't want to pay for things like that. And then, so the other kind of site of duplitecture that I went to was in the suburbs of Shanghai. It's called Town. And this is a replica British village. Here's a Harry Potter sculpture. It was actually like so delightful and beautiful. I took the subway for nearly 2 hours outside of downtown Shanghai. And then like it's this idyllic town where there's like a town square, there's restaurants, people are like all hanging out. A lot of stuff I looked about online, they were like, Town is a ghost town, it's so eerie. And I went there and it wasn't at all, which is kind of way cooler. Because like a lot of the things I was reading online, people were being like, yeah, they tried this experiment, it's totally failed. And like I went there and no, people love it. People were like having picnics with their family. And the one thing that this was the like castle, which was really beautiful. There was like a sculpture park outside of it, but there's tons and tons of wedding photos. So like you couldn't turn like anywhere without finding another couple. I think you can see about 7 couples here. But yeah, so like this church was really kind of a magnet for wedding photography. But like one thing that I think is interesting, so like looking at all of this, reproduction is kind of like, you know, you question like, okay, so what does it mean to be original? But like things are just getting built at such a massive scale and so fast in China that like just all these things are happening. But then from things that are being replicated, you get this really awesome sense of like innovation and newness. Like, so this building, I saw it, I was kind of really curious about it. And I walked in and it was the most beautiful bookstore I had ever seen. There's like 12 different architectural styles that you like walk through in different ways, and just there's cafes, people are hanging out, and it's just the most astonishing piece of architecture I've ever seen. I was so obsessed with it. Yeah, it's just totally, totally beautiful. And I thought it's interesting because a lot of the stuff that, like from Shanzai to the duplitecture stuff, I feel like there's like this networked bottom-up kind of way of creation and innovation. It doesn't look the same way as our Western idea of authorship, but there's like just so many awesome and exciting things happening. And yeah, this is literally the best bookstore ever. That's also a hyperlink. You can go see pictures taken by a real photographer. These were all taken on a cell phone. I apologize if they haven't always been the best quality, but like, yeah, I was just running around with the cell phone and taking pictures of a bunch of stuff. So thank you all so much. These are some things for me to shine out. Cool. Does anyone have any questions? Or can I just like hang out? Sarah?
I think the only time I saw greenery in your photos was in the Thames village thing.
Mm-hmm.
Was that indicative of the landscape, or is that what your experience is, or was that just like what you chose?
That's definitely what I chose to photograph. I was super impressed with how much greenery there was in a lot of these cities. Like Shenzhen has this like giant central park that's like right next to Hashang Bay, and like there's trees on all the streets. There's like tons of park space. And even like as you go out to the suburbs, and then like it's like quite sprawling, but there's kind of mountainous regions where they're not built up because they're mountains. So there's just like tons of green space that goes out along there. Like it's really, really dense, but I wouldn't say it's like overwhelmingly not green. I don't know if that was
nice also is that waterfronts, like rivers and ocean fronts are beautiful too. Like,
yeah.
Yeah, Guangzhou, it's gorgeous.
I think Nat, our hand up first.
I was wondering, because a lot of your journey from coming in the West and just seeing China as like this online presence, very impersonal, to like seeing how personal all of the making is, like there are real people behind it, their family joins, they're just like making it work and pushing the product out of the door with a shiny box, like just like all of us are doing, basically being like, look better outside. Squint. Would you consider going back and making things and using these resources in China? Are you comfortable again with the maker identity, but the front end you seem to be less comfortable with?
That's an interesting question. I'm still working through that. I feel like fundamentally as a global society, we make too many things. And like, especially seeing somewhere like Yiwu, just like, you know, imagining shipping containers every day of this stuff going back and forth across the world, like makes me really feel nervous and overwhelmed and anxious for the globe. So I'm not sure that I want to do product design at a large scale. Like for a long time, it's something I thought I wanted to do. But at this point, I don't think that things are awful. And I think there's amazing stuff happening in China. And I think like there's so much like creativity and capacity. So to just like see, I don't know, the West as exploiting that, I don't think is accurate, but I'm not sure where I want to fit in that ecosystem at this point. But I have more information to decide that. Sagan?
How was the language barrier traveling around? Like, how much Chinese did you know going in, and like how much did you prepare for that?
I basically didn't know any Chinese, and I didn't pick up a ton. I would like to try learning Mandarin at some point moving forward, because I think that would open up a lot of conversations with people who weren't like coming from a similar background as I was. Like in Shenzhen, there's a lot of infrastructure for foreigners who are involved in like hardware related things. So it was pretty easy to get by. I mean, there were times when like I had no idea how to feed myself, but there's enough restaurants you could point at food that I was okay. But yeah, I think like if I like wanted to learn more about like how the Shanzai ecosystem or something like that works, like there's no way I can access those spaces without speaking Mandarin.
Question from the live stream. If you were to design and manufacture a product knowing what you know now, what step would you take?
I'm really interested in like the Fairphone. I don't know if anyone knows about this, but they were trying to do like a lot of transparent supply chain stuff and like source all their materials and minerals from ethical supply chains. And I like the idea of using the supply chain as a teaching tool. Because yeah, like I don't think that we consciously think about how different metals are involved in conflicts and that kind of thing when we use technology, which we do all the time. So I don't know what I would make, but I would want to be able to use the story of it in some sort of like capacity for sharing information.
And did you learn anything a little more concrete about like, say you've already got the design for your widget. Are you visiting factories or like how are you putting the pieces together? Is that what
everyone I've talked to says don't go with just your design for your widget. Like if you think you have a thing and you're gonna hand it to like China and then it's gonna come out the other end, you're gonna have a bad time. Like everyone who I've talked to who's done this successfully, like they're spending time, they're getting to know their factory. One interesting tip that I heard from people is like if you can't talk to the boss, if you can't go for dinner with the boss, the factory's too big for you. Like working alongside people and having everything set up and like really having a collaborative relationship is how people get products to market. You've seen like something like Pebble, they showed up in Shenzhen and they were like, we got all our funding on Kickstarter, we're gonna make a smartwatch. And just the way they wanted to do it wasn't gonna work, and then they shipped like years later. So yeah, like to actually like get something good made, I think it's really important to be working alongside the people who know how to do that. Did you have a question?
You kind of answered my question, but I guess you had access to all of these different spaces, like public markets and like these accelerators and all these different communities. What was your biggest challenge in getting in there as a foreigner and as an outsider?
Sometimes getting lost. To be honest, I got like really lost a lot of the time and it was pretty overwhelming, but like that would kind of be a bit easier as I got to know the city. Also, I think too, just like she's believing I could do it. Like, so I was nervous to like email someone and like show up somewhere, but like, what do I have to lose? I'm literally just gonna sit in a hostel room if I don't do something. So yeah, it's like talking to people could be challenging. Yeah, sorry.
I'm just curious what's next as you kind of look ahead. It seems like you obviously had like a time constraint around like resources and all that. What's next as you look ahead for your career and what you want to learn about?
So I would like to work in kind of like high level stuff around manufacturing. I'm not sure exactly what that looks like. I'm currently looking for work if anyone has any jobs. And I'm also working on my imaginary thesis. So this is kind of my imaginary colloquium. So now I'm moving towards writing my thesis. And yeah.
What imaginary institution is it?
It's called Imaginary University. I have 2 peers in my cohort. None of them could make it this evening, but Lindy's my thesis advisor. But yeah, so I'm going to try to synthesize a lot of the like thoughts and anxieties I have around the world and how much stuff there is into it into a series of essays. So it'll be forthcoming. Eric? And then Benzel.
Kind of extended onto like this question, but I was just thinking like you had all this access to all this like all these places and like meeting all these people at Shenzhen. I was just wondering how they sort of saw what they were doing, like how they sort of viewed technology. Was it just like a job, or was it really exciting for them? What kind of possibilities? Just to get a sense.
Yeah, I think it's a spectrum. Like, definitely a lot of people come to Shenzhen because there's a lot of opportunity, and this is just the work that's available. So I think they're maybe less excited about technology, and then people who are kind of like in a incubator accelerator space, like their job is very much like evangelize how the Internet of Things is going to change the way we interact. So like there's a lot of people who are like professionally excited about technology. And then like kind of everywhere in between the spectrum, I'd say like it's definitely somewhere where a lot of money can be made. So that appeals to a lot of people, I think, who are kind of ambivalent of how they get rich. They would just like to get rich, but definitely like I definitely met other people who I would say were like interested in manufacturing, working in manufacturing, because they just really like machines and processes. Like it was cool to nerd out machines with people. Just look at cool machines. Gonzalo?
So it's kind of a loaded question because you and I have already talked about this, but I'm really intrigued about the photo of the makerspace that the government has just built, and you said there's lots of them, but they're empty, and we've got in the streets, and that's where actual maker culture and people are actually doing things, and that's where we're really reaching out. Why do you think it is that the folks in the government don't build a bridge into those communities into the street and pull that in? Why is that not able to just come together?
That's an interesting question, and I mean, I don't know if there's any informed opinion I can make about it. It does seem like the kind of Western way that startups function with like VC capital is really exciting at a certain level. Like it seems like the government maybe wants to reproduce that, but like the kind of business reality on the ground seems to be that people are getting small loans from family and friends and like running their shop like small and growing incrementally. But I don't know why they're not supporting that in the same way. Sylvia Littner, who I had mentioned previously, she's written about this stuff a fair amount, so she's kind of like posed some questions about it in some of her work, but I don't think that she's come to any particular answers at this point either. And if anyone's going to do it, she's way more qualified than I am.
So, do you actually see people on electric buttons scooters in China or not?
Do you mean like the hoverboard
Yeah,
scooters?
yeah.
Oh yeah, like all the time.
So they actually use that as transportation?
Yeah, in the markets, like lots of people just be zipping around on them. Like it seems like some people got so into them they just like didn't want to walk anywhere anymore. But like most, like at one point we're in the market in Yiwu and we saw someone pushing a box on like a hoverboard scooter on their knees and like pushing the box to the market, and there's just boxes moving all the time. I was like, that is, I don't know, it was like the epitome of like the Yiwu market for me. It was pretty cool. Anthony?
So the way that you've presented Shenzhen just seems like technology and manufacturing is so prolific in every facet of life for everyone who lives in it. So my question is, how deeply entrenched is technology and manufacturing in the day-to-day life of citizens there? Like some of your pictures had like people shucking cell phones like they were beans in the street.
Yeah. It's interesting because it seems like it's everything, and then it's also like moving towards being less of everything. And I'm going to qualify that statement that sounds like doesn't make sense. Like, so you'd see people who are like soldering and reflowing a cell phone while they're talking on a cell phone, and like they have another cell phone next to them. Like in some level, like this is really, really deeply permeated. But as this ecosystem is creating a lot more wealth, like butting up against a bunch of the components markets, there's now high-end fashion markets. So it'll be like a high-end department store right next to like, the LED building. And so as more and more wealth is created, there's more and more like wealthy people, the kind of like leisure activities seem to be like taking over a lot. Like there's really beautiful restaurants and clubs in Shenzhen that I could not afford to go to. Like it's an incredibly wealthy city. So I think as more and more of that happens, and like people who've been involved in this stuff for a while, like create more wealth for themselves, they want different opportunities. So it'll be interesting to see how that shifts over time.
So my follow-up question is like, is there still poverty in Shenzhen, and like are the impoverished in Shenzhen as involved in technology and manufacturing as other levels of classes?
There's definitely still people who are living in poverty. Like, I don't understand how integrated this is into the city, so I don't want to make any broad assumptions based on things I don't necessarily understand. But like, there were like folks who seemed like perhaps they're homeless, like kind of walking around the streets. But I'm not sure like how they would fit into the ecosystem. I know a lot of people migrate to the city to work in factories, so there's definitely a lot of people who have risked a whole lot to get there, and who are working in like possibly precarious job situations. But so far as I understand, there still tends to be labor shortages. So I think for the time being, it's still a land of a lot of opportunity, but that's an assumption. So like anything about the nitty gritty of demographics, I don't know, don't quote me on it.
Thanks.
Cool, does anyone else have any questions, or we can all like party and clean up chairs?
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you guys so much. This is awesome. You're